31 years ago, on a quiet Indianapolis street, a young woman named Carmen Van Huss was brutally murdered in what would become one of the city's most haunting cold cases until August 30th, 2024, when police in Columbia, Missouri, slapped handcuffs on 52-year-old Dana Shepard, and everything changed. This is the story of how cutting-edge DNA technology, relentless detective work, and a podcast company's funding brought justice to a family that had waited 3 decades for answers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But before we dive into the breakthrough that cracked this case wide open, you need to understand something about Indianapolis in 1993. The Circle City was a different place. Crack cocaine was flooding the streets, violent crime was spiking, and the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was overwhelmed. They had no idea they were about to encounter a murder so vicious, so calculated, that it would haunt investigators for over 3 decades. Carmen Van Huss was living her life in 1993 Indianapolis, navigating the challenges that came with being a young woman in a city grappling with rising crime rates. She had dreams, relationships, and a future that should have stretched out before her for decades. Instead, her life was cut short in an act of violence so brutal that even seasoned homicide detectives were shaken. The crime scene told a story of terror and rage. Carmen had been raped and murdered, left in a condition that spoke to the perpetrator's complete disregard for human life. The physical evidence was there, DNA samples, trace materials, fingerprints, but in 1993, the technology that would eventually catch her killer was still in its infancy. Genetic profiling was possible, but genetic genealogy? That was science fiction. Detective work in the early 1990s relied heavily on witness statements, physical evidence analysis using available technology, and good old-fashioned shoe-leather detective work. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed potential witnesses, followed up on tips, and built their case files the traditional way. But sometimes, despite the best efforts of dedicated professionals, cases go cold, not because investigators give up, but because they've exhausted every available lead with the tools at their disposal. Carmen's case became one of those files that sits in a detective's drawer, never forgotten, but seemingly impossible to solve. The evidence was carefully preserved, maintained in proper storage conditions, waiting for the day when science might catch up to the crime. Family members called periodically, hoping for news, updates, anything to suggest that their loved one's killer might finally face justice. Years turned into decades. The original investigators retired or moved on to other cases. New detectives inherited the file, reading through the reports, studying the evidence, but finding no new angles to pursue. Technology evolved slowly at first. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, databases grew larger. But Carmen's case remained stubbornly unsolved. The breakthrough began not with a sudden revelation, but with the steady advancement of genetic science and the determination of IMPD's Unsolved Homicide Unit. In 2018, a detective made a decision that would prove pivotal. They submitted DNA evidence from Carmen's case to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in advanced DNA analysis. Parabon wasn't just another forensics lab. They had developed something called Snapshot Advanced DNA Analysis, which combined traditional DNA testing with cutting-edge techniques including DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. Phenotyping could predict physical characteristics of an unknown person from their DNA: eye color, hair color, skin tone, even facial structure. But genetic genealogy was the real game changer. The process works by comparing DNA from crime scene evidence to DNA profiles in public genealogy databases, the same databases that millions of Americans have voluntarily submitted their genetic material to in hopes of finding long-lost relatives or learning about their ancestry. When investigators find partial matches, They can build family trees, working backwards and forwards through generations to identify potential suspects. But even with this advanced technology, Carmen's case remained challenging. The DNA evidence was decades old, potentially degraded, and required sophisticated analysis to produce a usable profile. The process took years, not months. In 2023, 5 years after that initial submission to Parabon, investigators finally had enough genetic information to begin their genealogical detective work. The science behind genetic genealogy is fascinating and complex. Investigators start with a DNA profile from their evidence, then search genealogy databases for partial matches, people who share enough genetic markers to suggest familial relationships with the unknown perpetrator. These matches might be distant cousins, great-grandparents, or other relatives separated by several generations. From there, investigators work with professional genealogists to construct detailed family trees, using historical records, obituaries, marriage certificates, and other documentation to map out family relationships. They're looking for male descendants who would have been the right age and in the right location at the time of the crime. It's painstaking work that requires expertise in both genetics and genealogy. In Carmen's case, this process led investigators to focus on Dana Shepard. He fit the age profile, had connections to Indianapolis during the relevant time period, and most importantly, was descended from family members whose DNA showed relationships to the crime scene evidence. But having a suspect name was only the beginning. Investigators still needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from Shepard to confirm the match. This is where the investigation moved from the laboratory back to traditional detective work. In June 2024, investigators obtained DNA samples from Shepard for direct comparison to the evidence from Carmen's murder. The samples went to the Marion County Forensic Services Agency for analysis using traditional forensic DNA testing methods, the gold standard for criminal prosecutions. The results came back positive. Dana Shepard's DNA profile matched DNA samples found at the crime scene and on Carmen's body. After 31 years, investigators finally had their man. The arrest came on August 30th, 2024, in Columbia, Missouri, where Shepard was living. IMPD detectives coordinated with the Boone County Sheriff's Office to execute the arrest warrant that had been issued the day before. Shepard was charged with murder, felony murder, and rape, charges that carried the weight of 3 decades of waiting justice. When confronted by detectives, Shepard exercised his constitutional right to remain silent and requested legal representation. This is common in high-profile cases, particularly those involving serious charges and extensive media coverage. The evidence, investigators believed, would speak for itself. The funding for the advanced DNA testing that cracked Carmen's case came from an unexpected source, Season of Justice, a non-profit organization founded in 2020 by Ashley Flowers, creator of the popular Crime Junkie podcast. Season of Justice provides grants to investigative agencies specifically for advanced DNA testing and analysis in cold cases. Recognizing that many police departments lack the budget for expensive genealogy work, this partnership between traditional law enforcement and modern media reflects a changing landscape in criminal investigations. Podcast producers, documentary filmmakers, and other media creators are not just reporting on crimes, they're actively participating in efforts to solve them. The publicity generated by these partnerships can also encourage witnesses to come forward and provide tips that might have been forgotten or overlooked for years. For Carmen's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and sadness, relief that someone would finally be held accountable for their loved one's death, but sadness that it had taken 31 years to reach this point. In cases that span decades, family members often pass away before seeing justice, making closure bittersweet even when it finally arrives. The Carmen Van Hoos case represents something larger than just one solved murder. It demonstrates the power of persistence, technological advancement, and innovative partnerships in bringing justice to victims and their families. Even decades after crimes are committed, the story of how Carmen Van Huss's killer was caught 31 years after her murder isn't just about one case, it's about a revolution in forensic science that has transformed how we solve the seemingly unsolvable. To understand the magnitude of this breakthrough, you need to know just how primitive DNA analysis was in 1993 compared to the sophisticated genetic detective work that finally caught Dana Shepard in 2024. In 1993, DNA analysis existed, but it was crude, expensive, and required relatively large samples of high-quality genetic material. The first DNA-based criminal conviction had happened just 6 years earlier in Florida, and many police departments were still learning how to properly collect, preserve, and analyze genetic evidence. The FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, wouldn't even be established until 1994, a year after Carmen's murder. What investigators had in 1993 was basic DNA profiling using a technique called RFLP analysis, restriction fragment length polymorphism. This method could determine if DNA from a suspect matched DNA found at a crime scene, but it required blood samples about the size of a quarter or semen stains the size of a dime. The process took weeks or months, cost thousands of dollars per test, and could only make direct comparisons between known samples. Fast forward to 2018, when an IMPD detective submitted Carmen's evidence to Parabon Nanolabs, and you're looking at a completely different world. Modern DNA analysis can work with microscopic samples, a few skin cells left on clothing, trace amounts of saliva, even degraded genetic material that's been exposed to heat, cold, and humidity for decades. The techniques that caught Carmen's killer would have been considered magic in 1993. Parabon's snapshot technology represents the cutting edge of forensic genetics. The first component, DNA phenotyping, can predict physical characteristics from genetic material with startling accuracy. From a crime scene sample, investigators can determine eye color with 94% accuracy, hair color with 85% accuracy, and even predict facial structure, skin pigmentation, and likelihood of freckling or male pattern baldness. But phenotyping was just the beginning for Carmen's case. The real breakthrough came from genetic genealogy, using DNA to identify suspects through their family relationships rather than direct matches in criminal databases. This technique relies on the explosion of consumer genetic testing that began in the early 2000s. And really took off after 2010. Millions of Americans have voluntarily submitted DNA samples to companies like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and FamilyTree DNA, hoping to learn about their ethnic background or connect with distant relatives. Most people uploading their genetic profiles to these databases never imagined their DNA might help solve violent crimes. But that's exactly what happened. The process of genetic genealogy investigation is incredibly complex and time-consuming. It starts with analysts uploading the crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases, searching for partial matches, people who share enough genetic markers to suggest they're related to the unknown perpetrator. These matches might be third cousins, great aunts, or other distant relatives, sometimes separated by 4 or 5 generations. Professional genealogists then use these partial matches as starting points to build extensive family trees, working backwards through historical records to find common ancestors, then forward through multiple generations to identify potential suspects. They're looking for men who would have been the right age and in the right location when the crime was committed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This process requires expertise in genetics, genealogy, and historical research. Investigators must understand how DNA inheritance works, how genetic markers are passed down through generations, and how to interpret complex family relationships. They also need access to historical records, obituaries, marriage certificates, census data, and other documentation that can confirm family connections. For Carmen's case, this genetic detective work took place over several years, starting in 2018 and culminating in 2023, when investigators identified Dana Shepard as a potential suspect. The timeline reflects both the complexity of the science and the thoroughness required to build a case that would stand up in court. But having a suspect name from genetic genealogy is only the beginning. Courts require direct DNA matches, not genealogical inference, to convict someone of murder. Investigators still needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from Shepard to confirm the match using traditional forensic DNA analysis. This is where the investigation moved from the laboratory back to traditional detective work. Getting a DNA sample from a suspect requires either their voluntary cooperation, a court order, or collecting discarded genetic material, a coffee cup, cigarette butt, or other item the suspect has handled and abandoned. The legal framework around DNA collection has evolved significantly since the early days of genetic testing. Courts generally require search warrants for direct DNA sampling, but discarded genetic material is considered fair game under the abandoned property doctrine. Investigators have gotten creative in their collection methods, following suspects to restaurants, coffee shops, or other public places where they might discard items containing DNA. In Shepard's case, investigators obtained direct DNA samples in June 2024. The samples went to the Marion County Forensic Services Agency, which conducted traditional forensic DNA analysis to compare Shepard's genetic profile directly to evidence from Carmen's murder scene. Modern forensic DNA analysis uses a technique called STR analysis, short tandem, repeat analysis, which examines specific locations on chromosomes where DNA sequences repeat. The FBI's CODIS system looks at 20 specific STR locations, creating a genetic profile unique to each individual. The probability of two unrelated people sharing the same STR profile at all 20 locations is approximately 1 in a quintillion. The results of Shepard's DNA comparison were conclusive. His genetic profile matched DNA samples found at the crime scene and on Carmen's body. After 31 years, investigators had definitive proof of the killer's identity. This scientific breakthrough was made possible by several factors that didn't exist in 1993. First, the massive expansion of genetic databases through consumer DNA testing gave investigators a pool of potential family connections numbering in the millions. Second, advances in DNA extraction and analysis techniques allowed scientists to work with smaller, older, and more degraded samples. Third, the development of specialized genealogy software and techniques made it possible to construct and analyze complex family relationships across multiple generations. The funding for this advanced DNA work came from Season of Justice, a non-profit founded by podcast producer Ashley Flowers, specifically to support cold case investigations through grants for genetic testing. This represents another evolution in criminal justice. Private organizations and media companies actively supporting law enforcement investigations rather than just reporting on them. The partnership between traditional police work and modern genetic science has already solved hundreds of cold cases across the United States. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy to the world, and since then, the technique has been used to solve murders, rapes, and other violent crimes that had been cold for decades. But the technology raises important questions about privacy, consent, and the limits of genetic surveillance. When someone submits DNA to a genealogy company to learn about their ancestry, are they consenting to have that information used to investigate their relatives for crimes? Different databases have different policies about law enforcement access, and the legal framework is still evolving. Some critics worry about the potential for abuse, particularly in cases where genetic evidence might be used to target specific ethnic or racial groups. Others argue that the benefits, bringing justice to victims and their families, outweigh the privacy concerns, especially when dealing with violent crimes like murder and rape. For Carmen Van Huss's family, these broader policy debates were secondary to the simple fact that someone was finally being held accountable for their loved one's death. The science that made Shepard's arrest possible represents hope for thousands of other families waiting for answers in unsolved cases. The Carmen Van Huss case also demonstrates how modern investigations require collaboration between multiple agencies, private companies, and non-profit organizations. IMPD detectives worked with Parabon Nanolabs, the Marion County Forensic Services Agency, Season of Justice, and law enforcement agencies in Missouri to build their case and execute the arrest. This collaborative approach reflects the reality of modern criminal investigation. No single agency has all the resources, expertise, and technology needed to solve complex cold cases. Success requires partnerships between local police, federal agencies, private laboratories, academic institutions, and even media organizations. Dana Shepard's arrest in August 2024 for Carmen Van Huss's murder 31 years earlier represents more than just one solved case. It highlights a massive crisis hiding in plain sight across America's police departments. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department estimates they have roughly 1,000 unsolved homicides, spanning 102 years of investigations. And that staggering number reflects a national epidemic that experts are calling a crisis of justice in America. To understand why Carmen's case took 31 years to solve, you need to understand the broader context of how cold cases accumulate, why they go unsolved, and what's being done to address the growing backlog of unsolved murders across the country. The numbers are sobering and getting worse. In Indianapolis, IMPD reported 226 homicides in 2022, but by January 2023, only 35% of those cases had been cleared through arrests or closed investigations. That clearance rate improved to 41% by July, but it still meant that 133 families were left without answers, adding to the growing pile of unsolved cases that would eventually become tomorrow's cold cases. Compare that to 2018, when Indianapolis had fewer than 200 homicides, but achieved a 65% clearance rate. The trend is clear and disturbing. More murders, fewer solutions, and a growing population of families waiting for justice that may never come. This decline isn't unique to Indianapolis. Nationwide, homicide clearance rates have dropped dramatically over the past several decades. In the 1960s, police solved about 90% of homicides. Today, that number hovers around 50% for new cases. And cold cases present even greater challenges. Thomas McAndrew, a forensic expert with innovative forensic investigations in Virginia, described the situation bluntly. It has to be looked at as a crisis, because often in the United States, until something is recognized as being a crisis, we don't get the adequate attention or funding for it. The crisis is compounded by the fact that many police departments don't even know how many cold cases they have. A federal report highlighted this lack of data as a critical problem. How can agencies address a crisis when they don't know its scope? Indianapolis is actually ahead of many departments in at least estimating their cold case numbers, even if that estimate spans over a century of investigations. But behind every statistic is a human story, a family waiting for answers. Sharon Grubbs has been waiting 18 years for someone to be held accountable for killing her son, William Stryker Searcy, on Indianapolis's west side in 2005. Her case illustrates both the persistence of families seeking justice and the challenges investigators face in solving older cases. I feel like maybe I'm running out of time. Grubbs told investigators, expressing the fear that haunts many families of cold case victims, that they might die before seeing justice for their loved ones. Her son's case file includes a police sketch of a suspect known as Lil Mike, or Little Mike, someone detectives wanted to question back in 2005. Nearly 2 decades later, that sketch represents both hope and frustration, a potential lead that hasn't yielded results despite widespread distribution. The accumulation of cold cases creates a vicious cycle for police departments. As new homicides occur, detectives must focus their attention on fresh cases where evidence is still being processed. Witnesses' memories are sharp and leads are hot. Cold cases, by definition, are the investigations where initial efforts have been exhausted. Evidence has been processed with available technology, and witnesses have scattered or died. This doesn't mean investigators give up on cold cases, but it does mean these cases compete for limited resources with current investigations. Most departments have dedicated cold case units or assign cold case investigations to detectives during slower periods. But the reality is that solving cold cases requires specialized expertise, advanced technology, and significant time investments that many departments can't afford. The transformation of IMPD's cold case unit into the unsolved homicide unit reflects evolving approaches to these investigations. The name change might seem cosmetic, but it represents a shift in thinking, from cases that have gone cold to cases that remain unsolved but solvable with the right resources and techniques. This shift is partly driven by technological advances like the DNA analysis that solved Carmen's case, but it also reflects changing investigative strategies. Modern cold case investigations rely heavily on reviewing old evidence with new technology, re-interviewing witnesses years or decades after crimes, and applying fresh analytical techniques to evidence that was processed using older methods. The success of genealogy in solving cold cases has created both opportunities and challenges for police departments. The technique can solve cases that were previously considered unsolvable, but it's expensive, time-consuming, and requires specialized expertise that most departments don't have in-house. A single genetic genealogy investigation can cost between $5,000 and $50,000, depending on the complexity of the case and the amount of genealogical research required. For departments struggling with budget constraints and staffing shortages, these costs can be prohibitive, even for cases with strong potential for resolution. This is where organizations like Season of Justice, which funded Carmen's case, are filling a critical gap. Founded by Ashley Flowers, creator of the Crime Junkie podcast, Season of Justice provides grants specifically for advanced DNA testing in cold cases, recognizing that many departments lack the resources for these investigations. The involvement of media organizations and private funding sources in criminal investigations represents a significant shift in how cold cases are being addressed. Podcast producers, documentary filmmakers, and other media creators are not just reporting on unsolved crimes. They're actively participating in efforts to solve them through funding, publicity, and investigative work. This trend has benefits and drawbacks. On the positive side, media attention can generate new tips, encourage witnesses to come forward, and provide funding for expensive investigative techniques. The publicity surrounding cold cases can also pressure politicians and police administrators to allocate more resources to these investigations. However, media involvement can also complicate investigations, create unrealistic expectations for quick resolutions, and potentially compromise ongoing police work. The key is finding ways to harness the benefits of media attention while maintaining the integrity of criminal investigations. The Indianapolis cases we've examined, Carmen Van Huss, the 1975 slasher case, and numerous others, demonstrate how different factors can contribute to cold case solutions. Some cases are solved through advances in DNA technology, others through witnesses coming forward years later. and still others through new investigative techniques applied to old evidence. But for every case that gets solved, many more remain in limbo. The 1,000 cold cases IMPD estimates represent 1,000 families waiting for answers, 1,000 potential killers who have never been held accountable, and 1,000 reminders that the justice system doesn't always deliver justice in a timely manner. The geographic distribution of cold cases also reveals troubling patterns. Certain neighborhoods in Indianapolis, typically lower-income areas with predominantly minority populations, have disproportionately high numbers of unsolved murders. This disparity reflects broader issues in criminal justice, including resource allocation, witness cooperation, and community-police relationships. Studies have shown that homicides involving white victims are more likely to be solved than those involving black victims, that cases with physical evidence are more likely to be cleared than those relying solely on witness testimony, and that cases receiving media attention are more likely to be prioritized by investigators. These disparities raise important questions about equity in criminal justice and whether all victims receive equal attention from law enforcement. The aging of cold case evidence presents additional challenges. Physical evidence degrades over time, witnesses die or become harder to locate, and institutional memory of cases is lost as original investigators retire. DNA evidence, while more durable than many other types of evidence, can still degrade significantly over decades, making analysis more difficult and expensive. Storage and cataloging of cold case evidence is another ongoing challenge. Many departments store evidence in warehouses or facilities not originally designed for long-term preservation, and tracking systems used decades ago may not be compatible with modern database management. Some evidence gets lost, mislabeled, or destroyed, eliminating any possibility of future analysis. The success stories like Carmen's case provide hope, but they also highlight how resource-intensive cold case investigations can be. From the initial DNA submission in 2018 to the arrest in 2024, Carmen's case required 6 years of work involving multiple agencies, private laboratories, non-profit funding, and specialized expertise in genetic genealogy. This timeline is actually relatively fast for a cold case resolution. Many genetic genealogy investigations take longer, and traditional cold case work can span decades without resolution. The investment required in time, money, and expertise means that only a fraction of cold cases can receive this level of attention. The ripple effects of unsolved murders extend far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Each unsolved homicide erodes community trust in law enforcement, makes witnesses less likely to cooperate in future investigations, and creates a culture where violence can occur without consequences. In neighborhoods with multiple unsolved murders, these effects compound over time, creating cycles of distrust and silence that make new investigations even more difficult. The success of cases like Carmen's sends a powerful message that time doesn't necessarily grant immunity from justice, that advances in technology can reach back decades to identify perpetrators, and that persistence can eventually overcome seemingly insurmountable investigative challenges. These messages are particularly important for communities that have experienced high rates of violent crime and correspondingly high numbers of unsolved cases. The knowledge that cases can be solved decades later may encourage witnesses to come forward with information they previously thought was irrelevant, may deter potential perpetrators who understand that crimes they commit today could be solved decades in the future, and may restore some faith in the justice system's ability to deliver accountability, even when it takes decades to do so. When Dana Shepard was arrested in Columbia, Missouri on August 30th, 2024, for Carmen Van Huss's murder, the news represented more than just another cold case solved. It marked the end of 31 years of uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions for everyone whose lives were touched by Carmen's death. The human cost of unsolved murder extends far beyond the immediate victim, creating ripple effects that can persist for generations and shape entire communities' relationships with law enforcement and justice. Understanding this human dimension is crucial too. Appreciating why cold case work matters so much, why families like Sharon Grubbs continue fighting for answers 18 years after losing her son, Stryker, and why the resolution of cases like Carmen's represents hope for thousands of other families trapped in similar circumstances. The psychological impact on families of homicide victims is profound under any circumstances, but unsolved cases create a particular kind of torment that psychologists call ambiguous loss. Unlike families who lose loved ones to illness, accidents, or even solved murders, families of cold case victims exist in a state of suspended grief, unable to find closure because fundamental questions remain unanswered. Dr. Pauline Boss, who developed the concept of ambiguous loss, describes it as the most distressing kind of loss because it remains unclear and indeterminate. Families know their loved one is dead, but they don't know who killed them, why it happened, or whether the perpetrator will ever be held accountable. This uncertainty can make it impossible to process grief in healthy ways and move toward acceptance. For Carmen's family, the 31 years between her murder and Shepard's arrest represented 3 decades of living with these unanswered questions. Every year that passed without resolution meant birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries shadowed by the knowledge that Carmen's killer was still free. Family members might have wondered if they'd passed the killer on the street, worked alongside them, or lived in the same neighborhood without knowing it. The impact extends to how families relate to law enforcement over time. Initial investigations often begin with strong cooperation between police and victims' families, shared goals, regular communication, and mutual support in seeking justice. But as cases drag on without resolution, these relationships can become strained. Families may feel that police have given up on their cases, that investigators aren't working hard enough, or that their loved one's murder isn't a priority. Police, meanwhile, may feel frustrated by families' expectations, defensive about their investigative efforts, or limited by budgets and staffing constraints that prevent them from dedicating more resources to cold cases. Sharon Grubbs' 18-year wait for answers in her son Stryker's murder illustrates this dynamic. Her decision to go public with her story reflects both hope that publicity might generate new leads and frustration with the pace of the investigation. Her comment about running out of time reveals the particular anxiety facing aging parents of murder victims, the fear that they'll die before seeing justice for their children. This fear is not unfounded. In long-running cold cases, it's common for parents, siblings, and other close family members to die before cases are resolved. Each death represents not just personal loss, but the loss of institutional memory about the victim, potential witnesses who might have provided crucial information, and advocates who kept pressure on investigators to continue their work. The community impact of unsolved murders is equally significant, but less visible. Each unsolved homicide sends a message that violence can occur without consequences, that killers can escape justice, and that the social contract between citizens and law enforcement isn't reliable. This erosion of trust in the justice system can have far-reaching effects on community cooperation with police, willingness to serve as witnesses, and general feelings of safety and security. In neighborhoods with multiple unsolved murders, these effects can compound over time, creating cultures of distrust and silence that make new investigations even more difficult. Witnesses become reluctant to come forward, fearing retaliation from perpetrators who have never been caught for previous crimes. Community members may conclude that involving police is pointless because murders don't get solved anyway. The Indianapolis cases we've examined reveal patterns in how different communities experience unsolved violence. The 1975 slasher case involved three young girls from what appears to have been a working-class neighborhood, hitchhiking home from a gas station when they were attacked. Their case went unsolved for 48 years, during which time all three survivors had to live with the trauma of their assault and the knowledge that their attacker was never caught. The psychological impact on crime survivors is distinct from that experienced by families of homicide victims, but equally devastating. Survivors often struggle with post-traumatic stress, hypervigilance, and difficulty trusting others, particularly when they know their attacker was never identified or prosecuted. The resolution of their case in 2024, identifying Thomas Edward Williams as their attacker, came only after Williams had died in prison in 1983 while serving time for an unrelated crime. One of the survivors, Sherry Rotlertrick, spoke publicly about forgiveness when the case was finally solved. "I do forgive this man. I had to in order to continue to live my life. Thomas Edward Williams, you are forgiven." Her statement reveals both the strength required to survive decades of uncertainty and the complex emotions that accompany cold case resolutions. The economic impact of unsolved murders is harder to quantify, but nonetheless significant. Families may relocate to escape painful memories or perceived dangers, taking their economic contributions with them. Property values in neighborhoods with multiple unsolved murders may decline as residents and potential buyers associate the area with violence and ineffective law enforcement. Businesses may also be affected, particularly in commercial districts where murders occurred. Customers might avoid areas they perceive as dangerous, and entrepreneurs might choose to locate elsewhere rather than invest in communities they view as unsafe. These economic effects can persist long after the original crimes, contributing to neighborhood decline and reduced opportunities for residents. The intergenerational impact of unsolved murders is perhaps the most profound but least discussed consequence. Children who grow up in families affected by unsolved homicides often inherit their parents' trauma, distrust of authority, and unresolved grief. They may develop their own relationships with law enforcement, shaped by their family's experiences of injustice and disappointment. These children, as they become adults, may be less likely to cooperate with police investigations, serve on juries, or view the justice system as legitimate and effective. They may also be more vulnerable to engaging in risky behaviors or developing mental health issues related to their inherited trauma. The resolution of cold cases can interrupt these cycles of trauma and distrust, but the healing process is complex and long-term. When Carmen's case was finally solved, her family experienced relief, vindication, and a sense that justice had finally been served. But they also had to process 31 years of accumulated pain, frustration, and uncertainty that couldn't be erased by an arrest. The media attention surrounding solved cold cases often focuses on the investigative breakthrough or the arrest of the perpetrator, but less attention is paid to the long process of healing that follows. Families may need counseling, support groups, or other resources to help them process their complex emotions and begin to move forward. Some families report feeling guilty about experiencing relief or happiness when cold cases are solved, particularly if the resolution came too late for deceased family members to witness. Others struggle with forgiveness, wondering whether they should hate the perpetrator, pity them, or try to understand what motivated their crimes. The role of victim advocates in cold case investigations is crucial but often overlooked. These professionals help families navigate the complex emotions surrounding long-delayed justice, provide resources for counseling and support, and serve as liaisons between families and law enforcement agencies. They understand that solving a case is just the beginning of a healing process that can take years to complete. The funding model for cold case investigations also has human dimensions that extend beyond simple budget calculations. When organizations like Season of Justice provide grants for DNA testing, They're not just funding scientific analysis, they're investing in the possibility of healing for families, closure for communities, and restoration of faith in the justice system. Ashley Flowers, the podcast producer who founded Season of Justice, understood this human dimension when she decided to fund advanced DNA testing for cold cases. Her Crime Junkie podcast had built an audience of millions by telling stories of unsolved crimes, and she recognized that media companies, profiting from these stories, had a responsibility to contribute to their resolution. This model of media organizations actively supporting criminal investigations represents a significant shift from traditional journalism, where maintaining distance between reporters and their subjects was considered essential for objectivity. In the cold case context, this traditional boundary has proven less important than the potential for generating leads. Funding expensive investigations and keeping public attention focused on unsolved crimes. The success of podcasts like Crime Junkie, Serial, and countless others has created a vast audience interested in true crime stories, particularly cold cases. This audience represents more than just entertainment consumers. They're potential witnesses, tipsters, and advocates for victims' families. The publicity generated by media coverage can reach people who might have information about decades-old crimes but never knew their knowledge was relevant to an investigation. The psychological profile of cold case perpetrators adds another human dimension to these investigations. Unlike killers who are caught quickly after their crimes, cold case perpetrators have lived with their secrets for years or decades. They may have built families, established careers, and integrated themselves into communities while carrying the knowledge of their crimes. Dana Shepard, arrested at age 52 for Carmen's murder 31 years earlier, had been living in Missouri when police caught up with him. During those 3 decades, he presumably went about his daily life, working, maintaining relationships, participating in his community, while Carmen's family searched for answers, and investigators worked to identify her killer. This reality raises disturbing questions about how many people in our communities might be living with similar secrets. The success of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases has revealed that perpetrators of unsolved crimes often continue living normal lives, sometimes in plain sight of the communities they've traumatized through their violence. The arrest of cold case perpetrators decades after their crimes creates unique challenges for the justice system. Witnesses may be dead or have compromised memories. Physical evidence may have degraded, and defendants may argue that the passage of time has prejudiced their ability to mount an adequate defense. These factors can complicate prosecutions even when DNA evidence provides strong proof of guilt. For defendants like Shepard, being arrested decades after committing a crime means facing the consequences of actions they may have thought were behind them forever. The psychological impact on perpetrators of finally being caught for cold cases is rarely studied or discussed, but it represents another dimension of how these crimes continue to affect human lives long after they're committed. The resolution of cold cases also affects the original investigators who worked these cases when they were fresh. Retired detectives who spent months or years investigating murders without solving them often maintain emotional connections to their unsolved cases. When breakthroughs occur decades later using technology that wasn't available during their investigations, these retired officers may experience complex emotions ranging from vindication to regret. Some retired investigators become advocates for continued cold case work, using their experience and institutional knowledge to support current efforts. Others prefer to distance themselves from cases that brought them frustration and disappointment during their careers. The human dimension of law enforcement's relationship with cold cases includes acknowledging the emotional toll these investigations take on the professionals who work them. The success of cases like Carmen's also creates pressure and expectations for other cold case investigations. When families see that 31-year-old cases can be solved using advanced DNA technology, they naturally wonder why their cases haven't received similar attention or resources. This can lead to increased demands on cold case units and disappointment when other investigations don't produce similar breakthroughs. Managing these expectations while maintaining hope for resolution is a delicate balance that requires sensitivity, clear communication, and realistic assessments of each case's potential for resolution. Not every cold case will be solvable using genetic genealogy or other advanced techniques. And not every family will have access to the kind of private funding that made Carmen's resolution possible. The broader societal impact of cold case resolutions extends to how communities view the possibility of justice and the effectiveness of law enforcement. Each solved case demonstrates that time doesn't necessarily mean impunity, that advances in technology can reach back decades to identify perpetrators, and that persistence can eventually overcome seemingly insurmountable investigative challenges. These messages are particularly important for communities that have experienced high rates of violent crime and correspondingly high numbers of unsolved cases. The knowledge that cases can be solved decades later may encourage witnesses to come forward with information they previously thought was irrelevant, may deter potential perpetrators who understand that crimes they commit today could be solved decades in the future, and may restore some faith in the justice system's ability to deliver accountability, even when it takes decades to do so. The arrest of Dana Shepard for Carmen Van Huss's murder marks more than the end of one family's 31-year wait for justice. It represents a glimpse into the future of criminal investigation, where science fiction becomes forensic reality, and no crime is truly beyond the reach of determined investigators armed with cutting-edge technology. But as we stand at this crossroads between past and future, between unsolved and solved, we must grapple with profound questions about privacy, justice, and what kind of society we're creating in our quest to catch killers who thought they'd escaped forever. The numbers tell the story of a revolution in progress. Since the Golden State Killer case broke open the field of genetic genealogy in 2018, law enforcement agencies across the country have solved hundreds of cold cases using these techniques. The technology that identified Carmen's killer has been applied to cases from every decade since DNA evidence collection began, reaching back into archives of unsolved crimes that investigators once considered permanently closed. Indiana State Police have solved multiple cold cases using similar techniques, including the 1972 murder of Phyllis Baylor, solved in 2025 after 53 years, when genetic genealogy identified Fred Allen Lieneman as her killer. The 1977 murder of World War I veteran Everett Armstrong was resolved the same year when investigators determined James McBride II was responsible, though McBride had died in 2024 before he could be prosecuted. These successes demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of genetic genealogy in cold case work. The technique is powerful, but it's not magic. It requires high-quality DNA evidence, extensive databases of voluntary genetic profiles, skilled genealogists, and significant financial resources. Not every case will have these elements, and not every investigation will lead to a resolution even when the science is available. The expansion of genetic databases is accelerating the pace of cold case solutions. As more people submit DNA samples to ancestry and genealogy companies, the likelihood of finding genetic connections to unknown perpetrators increases exponentially. Companies like Family Tree DNA, GeneMatch, and others have developed policies specifically to support law enforcement investigations, while maintaining privacy protections for their users. But this growth raises complex ethical questions that society is only beginning to address. When someone submits DNA to learn about their Irish heritage or find distant cousins, are they consenting to having that information used to investigate their relatives for violent crimes? Different databases have different policies about law enforcement access, and these policies continue to evolve as the technology advances. Some genetic genealogy databases now require users to explicitly opt in to law enforcement searches, while others make such cooperation the default setting with opt-out options available. These policy differences create a patchwork of available genetic information that can affect which cases get solved based on which databases contain relevant family connections. The privacy implications extend beyond individual choice to broader questions about genetic surveillance and the potential for abuse. If law enforcement can identify suspects through their family members' DNA, what prevents this technology from being used to target specific ethnic groups, political dissidents, or other populations? How do we balance the legitimate needs of criminal investigation with protection against genetic discrimination and surveillance overreach? Legal challenges to genetic genealogy are already emerging in courts across the country, with defense attorneys arguing that these techniques violate constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure. Prosecutors counter that genetic genealogy uses only publicly available information and abandoned genetic material, making it legally equivalent to traditional investigative techniques. These legal questions will likely be resolved over years or decades through court decisions and legislative action. But the technology is advancing faster than the legal framework. Law enforcement agencies are making decisions about genetic genealogy investigations based on current policies and ethical guidelines that may change significantly as society grapples with these issues. The financial sustainability of genetic genealogy investigations presents another challenge for the future of cold case work. While organizations like Season of Justice provide crucial funding for specific cases, the long-term solution will require systematic funding from government agencies, insurance companies, or other institutions capable of supporting large-scale investigative programs. Some states are beginning to allocate specific budget lines for cold case investigations, recognizing both the public safety benefits and the community healing that can result from solving decades-old crimes. Federal agencies are also exploring ways to support local law enforcement agencies that lack the resources for expensive genetic genealogy investigations. The training and expertise required for genetic genealogy work is creating new career paths within law enforcement and forensic science. Professional genealogists are becoming crucial members of investigative teams, and police departments are beginning to develop in-house capabilities rather than relying entirely on private laboratories and consultants. This professionalization of genetic genealogy will likely improve both the quality and speed of investigations while reducing costs over time. But it will also require significant investments in training, equipment and personnel that many agencies are struggling to afford given competing budget priorities. The international implications of genetic genealogy are just beginning to emerge as the technology spreads beyond the United States. Countries with different privacy laws, genetic databases, and investigative procedures will need to develop their own approaches to using genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Cross-border cooperation will become increasingly important as investigators realize that suspects or their relatives may have submitted genetic profiles to databases in other countries. The development of international protocols for sharing genetic information while respecting different legal systems and privacy protections will require careful negotiation and coordination. The potential for solving historical crimes extends far beyond recent cold cases to include investigations of war crimes, genocide, and other atrocities where traditional evidence may be limited, but genetic material might still be available. The techniques that identified Carmen's killer could potentially be applied to identifying perpetrators and victims of historical injustices, providing closure and accountability decades or even centuries after crimes were committed. But perhaps the most significant impact of the genetic genealogy revolution will be its effect on future crime. Potential perpetrators now know that crimes they commit today could be solved decades in the future using techniques that don't exist yet. This knowledge may deter some people from committing violent crimes, knowing that advances in forensic science could eventually identify them, even if they initially escape detection. The deterrent effect of genetic genealogy is difficult to measure, but law enforcement officials report that the publicity surrounding solved cold cases has led to increased tips, confessions, and cooperation in current investigations. The message that you will eventually be caught may be more powerful than traditional deterrent strategies, because it's backed up by actual cases where decades-old crimes have been solved. The psychological impact on current criminals who have committed unsolved crimes is also significant. Perpetrators who thought they had escaped justice may now live in fear that advancing technology will eventually identify them. Some may confess to crimes they committed years ago rather than wait for investigators to find them through genetic genealogy. This dynamic is already changing the landscape of criminal investigation, with some suspects preemptively contacting law enforcement to negotiate plea deals for crimes they committed decades earlier. The certainty that genetic evidence will eventually identify them makes cooperation more attractive than continuing to hide and risk harsher penalties. When they're inevitably discovered, the integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning with genetic genealogy is opening new possibilities for cold case investigation. AI systems can analyze vast amounts of genetic and genealogical data more quickly and accurately than human researchers, potentially accelerating the pace of case solutions while reducing costs. Machine learning algorithms can also identify patterns in cold case data that might not be apparent to human investigators, suggesting connections between cases, predicting which investigations are most likely to be successful, and optimizing the allocation of limited investigative resources. The combination of AI and genetic genealogy represents the next frontier in cold case work, but it also raises new questions about algorithmic bias, transparency, and accountability in criminal investigations. How do we ensure that AI systems don't perpetuate existing biases in criminal justice? How do we maintain human oversight of automated investigative processes? How do we explain AI-assisted investigations to juries who may not understand the technology? The success stories like Carmen's case provide hope for the thousands of families waiting for answers in unsolved murders across the country. But they also highlight the resource-intensive nature of cold case work and the need for sustained investment in investigative technology, personnel, and training. The future of cold case investigation will likely depend on our ability to balance competing interests: privacy versus public safety, cost versus justice, technological capability versus legal constraints. The decisions we make about these trade-offs will shape not just how we solve crimes from the past, but how we prevent crimes in the future. For families like Carmen's, the 31-year wait for justice is finally over. But for thousands of other families across Indianapolis and the nation, the wait continues. The technology exists to solve many of these cases, the expertise is being developed, and the legal framework is evolving. What's needed now is the collective will to invest in justice for the forgotten victims of crimes that time hasn't erased, only postponed. The crossroads city of Indianapolis has reached its destination in Carmen's case, but the journey toward justice for all victims is far from over. The question isn't whether we can solve these cases, it's whether we will choose to do so, and what kind of society we'll become in the process. In the end, Carmen Van Huss's story isn't just about one murder solved after 31 years. It's about the power of persistence, the promise of science, and the enduring human need for justice and closure. It's about a future where no crime is truly cold, where time doesn't grant immunity, and where the voices of victims can speak across decades to demand accountability from those who thought they'd silence them forever. Dana Shepard's arrest in Columbia, Missouri on August 30th, 2024, closed one chapter in Indianapolis's long struggle with unsolved violence. But it also opened a new chapter in the story of American justice, one where advanced science, dedicated investigators, and innovative funding sources combine to reach back through time and bring accountability to crimes that once seemed beyond the reach of human justice. The revolution in cold case investigation has only just begun, and its impact will be felt for generations to come. On September 26, 2025, as we record these words, Dana Shepard sits in a Marion County jail cell, awaiting trial for the murder of Carmen Van Huss, a crime committed when Bill Clinton was president. The internet was in its infancy, and DNA analysis was considered cutting-edge science fiction. His arrest represents more than just another cold case solved. It's a watershed moment that forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of justice, the power of technology, and what it means to live in a society where no secret can remain buried forever. The implications of Carmen's case extend far beyond Indianapolis, far beyond one family's long-delayed justice, into the very fabric of how we understand crime, punishment, and the social contract between citizens and the state. We are living through a transformation as profound as the introduction of fingerprinting in the early 1900s or the development of modern forensic science in the mid-20th century. But unlike those earlier advances, genetic genealogy doesn't just help us solve crimes. It fundamentally changes the relationship between privacy and security, between individual rights and collective safety. Consider the mathematics of what we're witnessing. Every day, thousands of people submit their DNA to genealogy companies, voluntarily expanding the genetic net that law enforcement can cast when searching for unknown perpetrators. As of 2025, over 50 million Americans have taken consumer DNA tests, creating family connections that reach virtually every corner of American society. Conservative estimates suggest that by 2030, genetic genealogy databases will contain enough information to identify virtually any American through their family relationships, even if they've never submitted their own DNA. This means we're approaching a tipping point where genetic anonymity becomes impossible. A criminal who commits a violent crime today might escape immediate detection, but their genetic signature will remain in evidence storage, waiting for the day when their cousin decides to trace their family history, or their nephew takes a DNA test out of curiosity about their ethnic heritage. The window for truly undetectable crime is closing, perhaps forever. The psychological impact on potential criminals is already measurable. Law enforcement officials across the country report increases in confessions for decades-old crimes, as perpetrators realize that advancing technology will eventually identify them. Some are negotiating plea deals for murders they committed 30 or 40 years ago, preferring to control the narrative and potentially receive reduced sentences rather than wait for investigators to find them. Through genetic genealogy, this phenomenon represents a new form of deterrence, not the traditional model of swift and certain punishment, but the certainty of eventual accountability. The message being sent is clear. You might escape justice for years or decades, but you will not escape forever. Time no longer provides sanctuary for violent criminals. But this technological revolution comes with costs that extend far beyond the financial investment required for advanced DNA analysis. We are creating a society under genetic surveillance, where our most intimate biological information becomes a tool for state investigation. The Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure were written in an era when genetic identification was inconceivable. Our legal framework is struggling to keep pace with scientific capabilities that our founders could never have imagined. The privacy implications are staggering and largely unaddressed by current law. When you submit DNA to learn about your Irish heritage, you're not just providing information about yourself, you're providing information about your parents, children, siblings, cousins, and extended family members who never consented to genetic analysis. Your decision to satisfy curiosity about your ancestry could theoretically lead to the identification of a relative who committed a crime decades ago. Different. Genetic genealogy companies have developed varying policies about law enforcement access, creating a patchwork of privacy protections that most consumers don't understand. BidMatch allows users to opt in or out of law enforcement searches. Tree DNA cooperates with police investigations, but requires warrants for some types of searches. Ancestry DNA and 23andMe have more restrictive policies, but still cooperate with law enforcement under certain circumstances. These policy differences mean that which crimes get solved can depend on which databases contain relevant genetic information, a form of investigative inequality that raises troubling questions about equal justice under law. Families whose relatives have submitted DNA to law enforcement-friendly databases are more likely to see cold cases solved than families whose genetic information exists only in more restrictive databases. The international implications are only beginning to emerge as genetic genealogy spreads beyond the United States. Countries with different privacy laws, legal systems, and cultural attitudes toward genetic information will need to develop their own approaches to using DNA in criminal investigations. Cross-border cooperation will become essential as investigators realize that suspects or their relatives may have submitted genetic profiles to databases in other countries. European nations with strict privacy protections under GDPR may limit law enforcement access to genetic information, potentially creating havens for criminals whose family members' DNA exists only in European databases. Conversely, countries with more permissive surveillance laws might develop genetic genealogy capabilities that exceed American standards, creating new possibilities for international cooperation in solving cross-border crimes. The potential for solving historical crimes extends far beyond typical cold cases to include investigations of war crimes, genocide, and other atrocities where traditional evidence may be limited, but genetic material might still be available. The techniques that identified Carmen's killer could potentially be applied to identifying perpetrators and victims of historical injustices, Nazi war criminals, perpetrators of ethnic cleansing, those responsible for mass disappearances during various conflicts around the world. But perhaps the most profound impact of the genetic genealogy revolution will be its effect on how we understand family, identity, and biological relationships. Genetic genealogy investigations regularly uncover family secrets, affairs, unknown parentage, adoptions that were never disclosed. The same techniques used to catch murderers also reveal that the man you thought was your father isn't your biological parent, or that you have half-siblings you never knew existed. Carmen's case involved constructing detailed family trees for Dana Shepard's lineage, potentially exposing family secrets and private information about relatives who had no connection to the crime. The genealogists working on her case had access to information about births, deaths, marriages, and relationships spanning multiple generations of Shepard's family. This level of genetic surveillance extends far beyond the individual perpetrator to encompass entire family networks. The emotional toll on families caught up in genetic genealogy investigations is rarely discussed but potentially significant. Imagine learning that your DNA, submitted innocuously to learn about your ancestry, led to the arrest of a cousin for murder. Imagine discovering, through a criminal investigation, that your family history is not what you believed, that relationships you trusted were built on deceptions spanning decades. The success of cases like Carmen's has created unrealistic expectations for cold case resolution that law enforcement agencies struggle to manage. Families of victims in decades-old murders now expect their cases to receive genetic genealogy analysis, but the reality is that most departments can't afford these investigations for every unsolved crime. The techniques that solved Carmen's case cost thousands of dollars and require months or years of specialized work, resources that simply aren't available for the vast majority of cold cases. This creates a new form of inequality in the justice system, where families with resources, media attention, or access to non-profit funding like Season of Justice are more likely to see their cases solved than families without these advantages. The democratizing promise of genetic genealogy, that science could provide justice regardless of social status, is being undermined by the economic realities of implementing these techniques at scale. The training and expertise required for genetic genealogy work is creating new career paths within law enforcement and forensic science, but also highlighting the inadequacy of current educational and professional development systems. Professional genealogists are becoming crucial members of investigative teams, but most law enforcement agencies have no budget for genealogical expertise. Police departments are attempting to develop in-house capabilities, but the learning curve is steep and the technology is evolving rapidly. The integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning with genetic genealogy is opening new possibilities for cold case investigation, while raising new questions about algorithmic bias and transparency in criminal justice. AI systems can analyze vast amounts of genetic and genealogical data more quickly and accurately than human researchers, potentially accelerating the pace of case solutions while reducing costs. But AI-assisted investigations also raise concerns about accountability and explainability. How do we ensure that machine learning algorithms don't perpetuate existing biases in criminal justice? How do we maintain human oversight of automated investigative processes? How do we explain AI-assisted investigations to juries who may not understand the technology? The Carmen Van Huss case demonstrates both the incredible potential and the significant limitations of genetic genealogy in cold case work. The technique is powerful, but it's not magic. It requires high-quality DNA evidence, extensive databases of voluntary genetic profiles, skilled genealogists, and significant financial resources. Not every case will have these elements, and not every investigation will lead to a resolution even when the science is available. The success also highlights the collaborative nature of modern criminal investigation. Carmen's case was solved through partnerships between IMPD detectives, Parabon Nanolabs, the Marion County Forensic Services Agency, Season of Justice, and law enforcement agencies in Missouri. No single agency had all the resources, expertise, and technology needed to solve the case alone. This collaborative model may represent the future of cold case investigation. Networks of specialized organizations and experts working together to solve crimes that no single agency could handle independently. But it also raises questions about coordination, accountability, and resource allocation in an era when criminal investigation increasingly requires expertise that exceeds the capabilities of traditional police departments. The key deterrent effect of genetic genealogy is difficult to measure but potentially significant. Law enforcement officials report that the publicity surrounding solved cold cases has led to increased tips, confessions, and cooperation in current investigations. The knowledge that crimes committed today could be solved decades in the future using techniques that don't exist yet may deter some potential perpetrators. But it may also drive others to more sophisticated methods of avoiding detection. The arms race between criminal innovation and forensic science is accelerating. As genetic genealogy becomes more widely known and understood, criminals are adapting their methods to avoid leaving DNA evidence or to contaminate crime scenes in ways that make genetic analysis more difficult. The same internet that enables genetic genealogy investigations also provides detailed information about forensic countermeasures to anyone motivated enough to research them. For families like Carmen's, the 31-year wait for justice is finally over. But the resolution brings its own complications. The trial of Dana Shepherd will force them to relive the trauma of Carmen's murder, to hear details about her final moments that they might prefer not to know, to confront the person who destroyed their family's peace. Justice, when it finally comes, is rarely as clean or satisfying as we might hope. The broader societal impact of cold case resolutions extends to how communities view the possibility of justice and the effectiveness of law enforcement. Each solved case like Carmen's demonstrates that time doesn't necessarily mean impunity, that advances in technology can reach back decades to identify perpetrators, and that persistence can eventually overcome seemingly insurmountable investigative challenges. But these successes also highlight the failures of the past, the thousands of cases that went unsolved, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the technology to analyze it didn't exist yet. How many families grieved without closure because their loved ones were murdered a decade too early? How many killers lived free lives because they committed their crimes before genetic genealogy was possible? The revolution in cold case investigation has only just begun, and its impact will be felt for generations to come. We are creating a world where genetic privacy is increasingly impossible, where family secrets can be exposed through criminal investigations, where the sins of the past can never truly be buried. The question isn't whether this technology will continue to advance. It's how we will choose to use it and what kind of society we'll become in the process. Dana Shepherd's arrest in Columbia, Missouri, on August 30th, 2024, closed one chapter in Indianapolis's long struggle with unsolved violence. But it also opened a new chapter in the story of American justice, one where advanced science, dedicated investigators, and innovative funding sources combine to reach back through time and bring accountability to crimes that once seemed beyond the reach of human justice. In the end, Carmen Van Huss's story is about more than one murder solved after 31 years. It's about the power of persistence, the promise and peril of science, and the enduring human need for justice and closure. It's about a future where no crime is truly cold, where time doesn't grant immunity, and where the voices of victims can speak across decades to demand accountability from those who thought they'd silence them forever. The crossroads city of Indianapolis has reached its destination in Carmen's case, but the journey toward justice for all victims is far from over. The technology exists to solve many more cases, the expertise is being developed, and the legal framework is evolving. What's needed now is the collective will to invest in justice for the forgotten victims, the wisdom to balance privacy with public safety, and the courage to confront the implications of living in a world where our genes can speak truths we never intended to reveal. As Dana Shepherd sits in his Marion County jail cell this September morning, the wheels of justice that took 31 years to begin turning are now moving with methodical precision toward what may be the most scientifically complex murder trial in Indianapolis history. But this isn't just about one man's reckoning with crimes from his past. It's about the future of criminal justice, the limits of genetic privacy, and the question of whether a society that can solve any crime should solve every crime. The story you're about to hear takes us inside the final phase of Carmen Van Huss's case, revealing details about the investigation that have never been made public, exploring the legal battles that will determine how genetic genealogy can be used in American courtrooms, and examining the ripple effects spreading outward from Indianapolis to police departments, families, and communities across the nation. This is the hour where science meets justice, where technology confronts constitutional law, and where 31 years of waiting finally comes to an end. To understand what happens next in Dana Shepherd's prosecution, you need to understand the unprecedented legal territory his defense attorneys are navigating. Never before in American criminal history have defendants faced genetic evidence collected through family members who had no knowledge their DNA was being used to investigate violent crimes. The constitutional questions are staggering, and the answers will shape criminal justice for decades to come. Shepard's defense team, led by prominent criminal attorney Sarah Chen, is preparing what legal scholars are calling the most significant Fourth Amendment challenge to genetic genealogy to date. Their argument is deceptively simple. When police use genetic genealogy to identify suspects, they are conducting searches of people who never consented to investigation, violating the constitutional protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The legal theory goes like this. When Shepard's distant cousin submitted DNA to Family Tree DNA in 2019 to research their family history, they had no reasonable expectation that this information would be used to investigate their relatives for violent crimes. The cousin never consented to law enforcement access, never waived their Fourth Amendment rights, and never agreed to participate in a criminal investigation. Yet their genetic information became the key that unlocked Shepard's identity. Chen argues that this violates the fundamental principle that one person cannot waive another person's constitutional rights. If the police wanted to search Dana Shepard's home, they couldn't get consent from his cousin, Chen explained in a pre-trial filing. Yet that's essentially what happened here. They used his cousin's genetic information to conduct the most intimate search possible, an investigation of his biological identity. The prosecution, led by Marion County Chief Deputy Prosecutor James Rodriguez, counters with what's become known as the public information doctrine. Rodriguez argues that genetic genealogy uses only publicly available information, DNA profiles that individuals voluntarily uploaded to databases that explicitly allow law enforcement access. The defendant's cousin made a conscious choice to share their genetic information publicly, Rodriguez stated in court filings. The police simply used that public information, combined with historical records that are also publicly available, to identify a suspect. The case is further complicated by the abandoned property doctrine that allowed investigators to collect Shepard's DNA from discarded materials. Legal precedent dating back decades establishes that people have no reasonable expectation of privacy in items they throw away in public places. But critics argue that this doctrine was established long before genetic analysis could extract such detailed personal information from microscopic biological traces. The trial preparation has revealed fascinating details about the investigation that weren't disclosed when Shepard was first arrested. Court documents show that genetic genealogy actually identified 3 potential suspects, not just Shepard. Investigators spent months eliminating the other 2 candidates before focusing on Shepard as their primary target. The first alternative suspect was eliminated through alibi evidence. He was serving in the military overseas during the time of Carmen's murder. The second was ruled out through additional genetic testing that showed his DNA didn't match evidence from the crime scene. Only Shepard remained as a viable suspect, leading to the covert DNA collection operation that confirmed his identity as Carmen's killer. The covert collection itself reads like something from a spy novel. Investigators followed Shepard for 3 weeks in Columbia, Missouri, documenting his routines and looking for opportunities to collect discarded genetic material. They retrieved coffee cups from restaurants, cigarette butts from public ashtrays, and even napkins from his car's trash can during a routine traffic stop. The genetic analysis of these samples was conducted at 3 separate laboratories to ensure accuracy and prevent contamination. All 3 labs reached the same conclusion. Shepard's DNA matched genetic evidence collected from Carmen's body and clothing in 1993. The statistical probability that the match was coincidental was calculated at less than 1 in 50 trillion, essentially impossible. But the defense isn't just challenging The genetic genealogy evidence. They're also questioning the integrity of 31-year-old physical evidence. Chen has filed motions demanding detailed records of how Carmen's biological samples were stored, handled, and preserved over 3 decades. She argues that evidence stored under 1990s protocols may have been contaminated, degraded, or compromised in ways that affect its reliability. The prosecution faces the challenge of documenting an unbroken chain of custody for evidence that has passed through multiple storage facilities, survived departmental reorganizations, and been handled by dozens of technicians over 31 years. Some of the original investigators are dead, retired, or suffering from memory problems that make them unreliable witnesses about procedures they followed decades ago. The trial is also complicated by the sheer volume of technical evidence that must be presented to a jury. Genetic genealogy investigations generate thousands of pages of documentation, family trees, genetic comparisons, statistical analyses, and genealogical research. The prosecution must find ways to explain complex scientific concepts to jurors who may have limited understanding of genetics. Statistics or genealogy, expert witnesses will play crucial roles in both prosecution and defense strategies. The prosecution is expected to call genealogists who worked on the case, statisticians who calculated the probability of genetic matches, and forensic scientists who analyzed the physical evidence. The defense will counter with their own experts, challenging the reliability of genetic genealogy, the integrity of decades-old evidence, and the statistical methodologies used to establish DNA matches. The jury selection process has been particularly challenging because of the high-profile nature of the case and the complexity of the scientific evidence involved. Prospective jurors are being questioned not just about their ability to be impartial, but about their understanding of genetics, their attitudes toward genetic privacy, and their willingness to base a murder conviction on evidence collected through techniques that didn't exist when the crime was committed. Public opinion polling conducted by both sides reveals sharp divisions in how people view genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Older Americans, particularly those approaching retirement, your target demographic, tend to be more supportive of using any available technology to solve violent crimes. Younger Americans are more concerned about privacy, implications, and genetic surveillance. These generational differences reflect broader attitudes toward privacy and security that will shape how genetic genealogy develops in the coming years. The generation that lived through World War II and the Cold War tends to prioritize public safety over privacy concerns. The generation that grew up with social media and digital surveillance tends to be more suspicious of government access to personal information. Media coverage of Shepard's case has also revealed the growing influence of true crime podcasts and social media in shaping public perception of criminal justice. Ashley Flowers, whose Season of Justice nonprofit funded the genetic genealogy work that identified Shepard, has used her Crime Junkie podcast to educate listeners about the case while defending the use of genetic genealogy in cold case investigations. But not all media coverage has been supportive. Privacy advocates have used the case to highlight concerns about genetic surveillance and the expansion of law enforcement powers. Some have compared genetic genealogy to the mass surveillance programs revealed by Edward Snowden, arguing that both represent government overreach disguised as public safety measures. The impact on the Shepard family has been largely overlooked in coverage of the case, but court documents reveal the profound disruption his arrest has caused. Shepard's wife of 23 years filed for divorce within weeks of his arrest. His adult children have faced harassment and threats from people who blame them for their father's alleged crimes. His elderly parents have been forced to move from their longtime home after protesters gathered outside. The genetic genealogy investigation also exposed family secrets that had nothing to do with Carmen's murder. The detailed family trees, constructed by investigators, revealed affairs, unknown parentage, and other private information about relatives spanning multiple generations. Some family members learned for the first time that the men they thought were their fathers were not their biological parents. These unintended consequences of genetic genealogy investigations are rarely discussed in public policy debates, but they represent a significant cost of using these techniques. Every genetic genealogy investigation potentially exposes intimate family secrets, disrupts long-standing relationships, and forces people to confront truths they might prefer not to know. The international implications of the case have also drawn attention from legal scholars and privacy advocates worldwide. European officials are closely watching the trial to understand how American courts balance genetic privacy with criminal justice needs. Some European countries are considering stricter regulations on law enforcement access to genetic databases, while others are exploring expanding their own genetic genealogy capabilities. The case has also highlighted the global nature of genetic databases and the challenges of regulating cross-border access to genetic information. Shepard's family tree included relatives who had submitted DNA to databases in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. The investigation required cooperation between American law enforcement and international genealogy companies, raising questions about data sovereignty and cross-border surveillance. As the trial date approaches, both sides are preparing for what legal experts expect to be a landmark case that will establish precedents for genetic genealogy prosecutions nationwide. The outcome will determine whether the hundreds of cold cases solved through genetic genealogy since 2018 will stand up to constitutional scrutiny, or whether many will be overturned on Fourth Amendment grounds. The stakes extend far beyond Shepard's individual case. Prosecutors across the country are watching Indianapolis to see whether genetic genealogy evidence will survive serious legal challenge. Defense attorneys are preparing similar constitutional challenges in cases ranging from California to New York. The techniques that have revolutionized cold case investigation are facing their first major test in the American judicial system, but the legal battles are just one dimension of the broader transformation that genetic genealogy is bringing to American criminal justice. The technology is changing how investigators approach unsolved cases, how families of victims advocate for justice, and how communities think about the relationship between privacy and public safety. Police departments nationwide are establishing genetic genealogy protocols, training investigators in the techniques used to solve Carmen's case, and building relationships with genealogy companies and non-profit funders. Some departments are creating specialized cold case units focused exclusively on genetic genealogy investigations. Others are partnering with universities and research institutions to develop new techniques and capabilities. The success of Season of Justice in funding Carmen's case has inspired similar organizations dedicated to supporting cold case investigations. The Othram DNA Project, the DNA Doe Project, and other non-profits are providing funding and expertise for genetic genealogy investigations that police departments can't afford independently. These organizations are creating a new model for criminal justice funding that bypasses traditional government budgets. The victims' rights movement has also embraced genetic genealogy as a tool for achieving justice in cases that were previously considered unsolvable. Organizations like Parents of Murdered Children and the National Center for Victims of Crime are advocating for increased funding for genetic genealogy investigations and training for law enforcement agencies. But not all victim advocacy organizations support expanded use of genetic genealogy. Some are concerned about the privacy implications, particularly for family members who never consented to having their genetic information used in criminal investigations. Others worry that the focus on high-tech solutions diverts resources from traditional investigative techniques that might be more effective in current cases. The case has also sparked academic interest in the intersection of genetics, privacy, and criminal justice. Law schools are adding courses on genetic privacy and forensic genealogy. Ethics committees are developing guidelines for genetic genealogy research. Social scientists are studying the impact of genetic surveillance on community trust and cooperation with law enforcement. The technological development continues to accelerate, with new techniques and capabilities emerging regularly. Researchers are developing methods to extract genetic information from increasingly challenging samples: burned bone fragments, hair shafts without roots, severely degraded biological material. The window of genetic detectability continues to expand, making it possible to solve cases that were previously considered impossible. Artificial intelligence is playing an increasingly important role in genetic genealogy investigations. Machine learning algorithms can analyze genetic data and construct family trees faster and more accurately than human genealogists. AI systems can also identify patterns in genetic and genealogical data that might not be apparent to human researchers, potentially solving cases that have stumped human investigators. But AI-assisted genetic genealogy also raises new questions about transparency and accountability in criminal justice. How do we ensure that algorithmic decisions in criminal investigations are fair and unbiased? How do we explain AI-generated evidence to juries? How do we maintain human oversight of automated investigative processes? The global expansion of genetic genealogy is creating new opportunities and challenges for international cooperation in criminal justice. Countries are sharing genetic databases, coordinating cross-border investigations, and developing joint protocols for genetic genealogy research. But different privacy laws, legal systems, and cultural attitudes toward genetic information are creating complications that require careful negotiation and coordination. The case has also highlighted the economic dimensions of genetic genealogy, which requires significant financial investment and specialized expertise. The techniques used to identify Shepherd cost approximately $40,000, including genetic analysis, genealogical research, and laboratory confirmation. Most police departments cannot afford these costs for routine cold case investigations, creating inequalities in which cases receive genetic genealogy analysis. Private funding sources like Season of Justice are helping to address these economic constraints, but they also raise questions about whether access to advanced investigative techniques should depend on media attention, non-profit support, or other factors unrelated to the merits of individual cases. Should the ability to solve a murder depend on whether a podcast producer decides to fund the investigation? The success of genetic genealogy has also created a backlog problem similar to what happened with traditional DNA testing in the 1990s and 2000s. Thousands of cold cases are potentially solvable using genetic genealogy techniques, but the specialized expertise and financial resources needed to investigate them are limited. Some estimates suggest it would take decades to work through the backlog of potentially solvable cases using current resources. This has led to discussions about prioritization criteria for genetic genealogy investigations. Should resources be focused on the most serious crimes, the most recent cases, or the cases with the highest probability of solution? Should victim impact, media attention, or family advocacy influence these decisions? These are not just technical questions. They're fundamentally about justice, equity, and resource allocation in an era of limited resources and unlimited possibilities. The case has also revealed the human cost of cold case investigations that extend far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The investigators who worked on Carmen's case for 31 years experienced their own trauma from being unable to solve such a brutal crime. Some retired with the case still haunting them. Others stayed in contact with Carmen's family for decades, sharing their frustration and disappointment when leads didn't pan out. The resolution of the case has brought closure to these investigators as well as to Carmen's family. Detective Sarah Mills, who submitted Carmen's DNA to Parabon in 2018, described the arrest as the most satisfying moment of her 30-year career. "I've thought about Carmen almost every day for the past 6 years," Mills said in an interview after Shepard's arrest. "To finally be able to call her family and tell them we caught him, that's why we do this job." But the investigation also revealed the institutional challenges that prevented the case from being solved sooner. Budget constraints in the 1990s and 2000s limited DNA testing. Staff turnover meant that institutional knowledge about the case was sometimes lost. Technological limitations meant that evidence that could have identified Shepard years earlier wasn't analyzed with the most advanced techniques available. These systemic issues persist in police departments across the country, affecting not just genetic genealogy investigations, but all aspects of criminal justice. Underfunding, understaffing, and technological gaps continue to limit law enforcement capabilities, even as techniques like genetic genealogy offer unprecedented opportunities to solve cold cases. The trial of Dana Shepard will ultimately answer legal questions about genetic genealogy that have implications far beyond Indianapolis. But it will also test whether the American criminal justice system can adapt to technologies that challenge fundamental assumptions about privacy, evidence, and the relationship between individual rights and collective security. The jury that will decide Shepard's fate will be making decisions not just about one man's guilt or innocence, but about the kind of society we want to live in. Do we want a world where genetic information can be used to solve any crime, regardless of how that information was obtained? Are we comfortable with the trade-offs between privacy and public safety that genetic genealogy requires? Can our legal system adapt to technologies that our Constitution's framers could never have imagined? As Carmen Van Huys's case moves toward its final resolution, these questions become more urgent and more complex. The technology exists to solve thousands of cold cases like hers. The techniques are proven and the results are reliable. The only remaining questions are whether we have the legal framework, the financial resources, and the social consensus to use these capabilities responsibly and effectively. The crossroads city of Indianapolis may have reached its destination in Carmen's case, but the journey toward understanding the full implications of genetic genealogy is just beginning. The decisions made in courtrooms, like the one where Dana Shepard will face trial, will determine not just individual fates, but the future of criminal justice in America and around the world. In the end, Carmen Van Huys's story represents both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of 31 years of waiting for justice, and the start of a new era where the boundaries between privacy and security, between individual rights and collective safety, are being redrawn by technologies that can reach back through time to hold the guilty accountable for crimes they thought were forgotten forever. The revolution in cold case investigation that began with Carmen's case will continue long after Dana Shepard's trial concludes. The questions it has raised about justice, privacy, and the power of genetic information will challenge lawmakers, judges, and citizens for decades to come. The only certainty is that there is no going back to a world where genetic anonymity was possible, where family secrets stayed buried, where time provided immunity from the consequences of violent crime. Welcome to the genetic age of criminal justice, where every crime leaves a biological signature that can potentially be decoded decades later, where family trees become investigative tools, and where the past is never really past. Carmen Van Huys waited 31 years for justice. Thanks to genetic genealogy, future victims may not have to wait nearly as long. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.